Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. So I do have the round 9 Armageddon game between Wang Hao and Wesley from the Altibox Norway chess tournament. So all of my people that are coming from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay. Maraming salamat aking makaibigan for coming by and taking a look at my video. I appreciate it very much. Anybody who is coming from China, I will say ni hao and shishini. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. But if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. So we got d4, knight comes to f6. We got c4, e6. Knight comes to c3, inviting the Nimzo-Indian if you want to play it. And that is what we see. Bishop comes to b4. We do see e3, castles by black, a3. Bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3. You know, we have just brought another pawn into the center of the board. So we have a gigantic clump of pawns. So that can be good. You know how to play with it. Wesley So says, man, I don't want you to have a great pawn center. So c5 is a very well-timed move. And you don't really want to take here because you're going to have triple pawns. And, you know, your stuff's just going to look ugly. And it's going to be attackable. So you don't want to have that. So we see bishop coming to d3. We got knight to c6. Knight comes up to e2. We see b6. Castles by white and bishop to a6. And this is a very common idea. You know, anytime white has a pawn on c4 without a supporting b pawn, and the d pawn is already, you know, pretty much on its side, you know, you have the ability to go bishop to a6 and knight to a5, and you are putting a lot of pressure on that pawn. So we do have e4, knight comes back to e8. We see f4, and then we do have f5, and then we see knight to g3 by white. Now, backing up, after we see f4, you know, like I said before with the bishop to a6, knight to a5 thing, this can cause some problems for white. And if you do something like queen coming to a4, knight coming to d6, will be pretty lights out because you do have too many attackers on this pawn. So it has become a problem. But like I said, we did not see that. We got knight coming over to g3. We see g6. Pawn takes c5. Pawn takes c5. And then we do see bishop to e3. Just, you know, throwing a little tickle on this pawn. But we do cover that with d6. We got queen up to a4. And then we do have knight to a5. And that is the novelty of the game. The major difference between this situation and the one I mentioned a second ago is knight to a5. Putting pressure on c4, the bishop also putting pressure on c4. You do not have the ability to play knight to d6 to add that pressure on. So that's the subtle difference between this one and that one. We do see rook 8 to d1. We got queen over to c7. Pawn takes f5. Pawn takes f5. We do see rook f to e1. Knight down to f6. We got knight down to f1. Rook a to e8. Bishop goes down to f2, encouraging a trade. We're trying to take over that file. And the bishop does come back to b7. A super logical move because, I mean, since you can't win this pawn, the bishop being on a6 doesn't really do anything. Also, this knight being over here on a5 doesn't really do anything. So you really want to try to redirect your pieces around. You know, and this diagonal is a much better diagonal than this one for this bishop. So we do see knight coming up to e3. We see queen down to c6. And we're trying to toss a checkmate in there. The important thing that you have to be paying attention to as white is that black does have the ability to capture this knight and undefend this g2 square. So you have to make sure that you're paying attention to that. You need to make sure that you're making moves that highlight that. So you are either going to go queen takes c6 and just like completely get rid of that threat, or you're going to go down to queen to c2. Like we see in the game. And then after, if the rook would take here, of course, you take back with the bishop and you have managed to laterally defend a g2. So, like I said, queen to c2 is what we see in the game. So, of course, we don't see rook takes e3 because then it doesn't have any potency to it. The queen retreats back to d7. We see bishop up to h4. Knight goes over to h5. And this is a very interesting look in the position. We have knights, both the knights for black are on the rim. So not just one, but two. Crazy. The queen goes over to f2. We see bishop back to a6. You know, we're steadily trying to get that pawn, but it would take a rook sack on e3 to get that pawn. So the knight comes to d5. We see king down to g7, and we have reached a really critical point. If you do want to pause the video and see what move white can play in this position to make things very hard for black, go ahead and do so. Okay, so like I mentioned before, we do have knights on the rim. The problem with this knight that's on this rim over here is that we have the ability to attack it and damage black's structure. And we have a lot of pieces that are kind of hanging out over here. This bishop is hanging out. This bishop is hanging out. This knight is hanging out. This rook is cutting off this file. So, you know, things are looking very strong for white. The move is bishop down to e2. Like I said, I mean, we want to try to remove this knight. The queen is in a really good spot. And so if we move bishop to e2, I mean, you basically want to sacrifice the rook on e2 for this bishop. But if you have the mind to say, hey, man, I can just retreat back to f6 with my knight, you know, I'm protecting it with my rook and with my king, you know, you would have to give up the exchange anyway. So if you see knight back to f6, bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, knight takes f6, king takes f6. You have bishop coming to f3. You're not worried about this pawn because you have this file taken care of. This bishop is on a good diagonal. This queen is about to possibly come to h4. And I mean, you can see that, you know, the king is kind of running out of squares to go to. But we don't see that. After king came to g7, we did see queen down to f1. And then we got rook taking e1, rook taking e1, a rook over to e8. Now the bishop does come down to e2. We see queen over to f7 because this, you know, taking this pawn is trying to be very live. We do see rook down to d1, just trying to make sure that we protect this knight if this pawn does drop. And it is at this point that rook takes e2. Now, Wesley So was really, I mean, he was really kind of fearing, you know, the bishop taking on h5 in this position. So he went ahead and got rid of it. And he was feeling like he was going to go ahead and get some play. We do see queen taking e2, bishop taking c4, and then we do have queen up to f3. We got bishop down to b3. So we're just really harassing the rook here. And so, you know, the rook is really kind of trying to find somewhere comfortable to go. There really isn't a whole lot of places they can go. The rook goes up to d2. We see knight to c4, and then we see rook to e2. But this actually really stinks because of bishop to d1. And we are going to be getting our exchange back as black. So this was like a severely relief moment for Wesley. So even though, I mean, he can get a draw in this game and be all right. The knight goes back to e7. We see bishop taking e2 because, of course, you're going to take the exchange. And then queen taking e2. Knight taking f4. Queen going down to f1. The knight going back to h5. Queen coming up to f3. We see h6. And g5 is a very real threat. And we are trying to disconnect this bishop from the protection of this knight. So we really have to do something about that. There isn't a lot of great options, though. We do see queen up to b7, and then after g5, we do see bishop to f2, and then we have king down to f6. Now, Wesley So's idea is to try to, like, basically this knight is pinned to this queen. So we are trying to just, like, basically win this knight. The only problem was there was two moves that you can make. King to f8, king to f6. The problem with king to f6 is it runs into knight to d5 check, which is what we see in the game. If you did go king up to f8, then you would not be seeing that, and the knight on e7 would just be a free piece. So that was an improper way to go about it in this particular situation. So like I said, knight came to d5, king went back to g7. We see queen down to c6, knight goes to f6. And we see knight taking f6, queen taking f6, and these trades are just helping black get in a much better position. So we do see queen to b7 with check. We see king down to g6. The queen goes to d5. We see queen up to f7. The queen goes down to d3. Queen goes to e6. Queen goes down to d1. We see knight taking a3. So there another pawn drop. So now we have 6 pawns versus 3. So Wesley So is, I mean, he's sitting in a really beautiful position. And at the end of the day, he only needs a draw. So we do see h4 trying to drum up some type of counterplay. We do see pawn taking h4, bishop taking h4, knight back to c4. We see bishop down to f2. The queen goes to e4, just constantly just improving the position. We do see queen over to a4. We got a5. The queen goes up to d7. We're trying to infiltrate, see if we can get something rolling. So the queen goes to e5. We see queen back down to a4. Queen goes to e4. Queen goes back up to d7. And Wesley So just says, hey, man, I'll take the draw. because the draw gives me the win that I need. So Wang Hao, he varies his move and goes to queen to d8. The queen goes up to e6. We see queen over to a8. King goes up to f7. We see queen to b7 with check. The king goes back down to g6. Queen goes back to a8. King comes back up to f7. The queen goes back to b7 with check. We see king down to g6, and then we have a drawn of the game. So Wesley So got his draw that he needed to win. For some reason, they make this Armageddon where either you get a draw or a win, and it pretty much counts as a win, and you get 3 less minutes as black. So it's a little bit weird, but I mean, that's just the way they decided to do it. And so Wesley So got his point for the round. So that is that game. This is the lighter analysis video, so I shortened it up considerably. So I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Maraming salamat aking makaibigan, and shishini for anybody coming from China, and I will see you guys next time.